This is the Weigh In podcast by Ben Watt Chestnut. And on today's Weigh In, we're going to talk to you about the NCAA transfer portal. So, as you know, on our Takedown Thursdays, we always talk wrestling. And on this Takedown Thursday, we talk about the NCAA transfer portal. And, in regards to that, we're talking about, is it wrestling's draft? And I say that because, they're contacting guys left and right. You're going after guys like crazy. It's like you say, okay, for instance, if a Penn State wrestler decided I'm going to transfer, it's like everybody's chomping at the bit to contact them and saying, hey, come here, come there. So let's size it up. Really, let's size it up. When you look at it, the NFL draft, you're a prospect. You have teams look at you. You have teams talk to you. And then ultimately on draft night, you're called. So you kind of say, okay, well, is that kind of similar here? Now, hear me out. You're in the transfer portal. You say, okay, let's say, for instance, guy goes in the transfer portal. Now you got all these teams contacting saying, well, he was good last year. He was an All-American. Yeah, I want him. In terms of like, okay, let's say in terms of Dean Peterson, you know, where's he going to land? You say like, okay, you kind of look at it, who's going to draft him? It's like, all right, hey, you want Dean? Yeah, I pick him. You're not going to go get a guy at the transfer portal and then not have him, at least compete or start for you. That doesn't, I don't see where that becomes sensible. But you look at this transfer portal and you say, okay, is this, sensible? Is there something going on here where, this is definitely becoming a interesting fact of the matter? And I say that because there is a lot going on where it's like, okay, you know, what's going on here in a sense where you say, okay, what's going on enough to say this is something good, this is something that's not good. And that's why I say, hey, is it something good? You know, and that's why I say that, is it something good? Because you look at the guys who, is it something going well? You know, is it something, that, and is it something that you're saying, okay, maybe no, you're wrong, it isn't like a draft, but it, to me, it kind of is, because you see that they're taking guys, you know, they're like they're just going left and right after these guys. And I guess it's like, it's a sense where it's like, it's so similar to the draft, it just so happens. And I kind of feel like that's just real crazy. And that's why I look and I say, is this transfer portal you know, a good thing? What is the latest? And you look at, and you look at, okay, so if we break down something latest, Zach Ryder of Penn State University hits the transfer portal. This is what we're talking about. And now, when you look at Zach Ryder, I will look up to see where he landed, if he has landed somewhere. But when we talk about guys leaving, we talk about Welch. Welch was from Ohio State. He ends up at Penn State. You're telling me as soon as he hit the transfer portal, Keel wasn't trying to, hey, come here, let me draft you. Let me, that's what I see this transfer portal as. And, you know, and, and that's a lot of good stuff. Like, let's talk about some of this stuff. Let's fact check some of this stuff. So, when I say that, I say there's a lot of good stuff that comes in and out of all this, of what's coming and what's been done. And let's get down to the bottom of what I call wrestling's draft. And I'll say for every sport has a transfer portal, but I consider it like a draft because you're looking at the best talent, you're contacting that best talent, and then you're trying to get them to say, hey, I want to go where you are. Only difference is in an NFL draft, you don't really get much of a choice of whether you want to not be picked or be picked. But here it's so similar. It's not something you can even. It's so similar. It's not something you can even say is different. Like it's just too. It's too close to each other. So as we take a look at some of this Ganter on this Zach Ryder, he has not landed yet. And you look at what did Rocco Welsh do. So what we're seeing in this right now, and this is something that I will definitely break down in a minute. And what it looks like is okay. Now you're starting to see if another bigger guy comes in, and Walsh, let's say Walsh and Ryder, you know, it's a situation where one doesn't want to bump up for the other. One doesn't want to even, it comes where he says one doesn't want to be with the other. You see, okay, and you're going to see a lot of that in the transfer portal. You're going to see that a lot of that. So, like, you pick up a guy where somebody else is like, I don't really like him, they're going to hit the portal. And it's almost like that's where I say, okay, now you put yourself out there to be drafted because at the same time, it's like, okay, it's not a draft, but you look at it, it's a draft, for instance. It's like, hey, it's a first come, first serve draft. If, Cornell or Ohio State decides to reach out to somebody who's in that portal, at the end of the day, it's like, hey, it's a draft. Now, the biggest talk that, I know we talk about a lot of stuff on this pod, brother. We talk about a lot of stuff on the pod, and this is going to be one of the things we definitely come out and talk about here is one of the biggest things is, okay, where will and when we talk about this, AJ Ferrari, had a what I thought was a successful season last year. Um, when you look at that, now let's talk about the transfer portal. You look at AJ Ferrari still out there. So as I'm saying the good old draft, no draft. But when you look at okay, there's a lot of guys out there that this is like okay, is this really a draft type moment? Now, there's one thing we can say to this is a lot of guys are going left, right, and when we look at this, you look at a lot of things like Rocco Walsh to Penn State. If you didn't know, Rocco Walsh went to Penn State. So, Kel Sanderson got that draft pick. What's the report was held to be say that everybody was in the know. Everybody wanted Rocco Walsh, but it didn't happen. And when you look at that, you say, okay, was that something soluble? And when you look at that, was it soluble? Was it not? The question here was this is a great question here. And the question that we look at here is, has it turned itself into a draft of some sort? I don't think it's as heavy in other sports as it is in wrestling, where you're really getting it. But we all already know the transfer portal has been around. It has not demised or did not cause there to be anything wrong with Kale Sanderson, that Kale Sanderson, that Kale Sanderson era. We've all figured out already. It has no negative effect on that Kale Sanderson. and Cael Sanderson's title run. But when you look at this year's Sanderson, yes, they beat last year's team, but like we talked about on here, we talked about the Oklahoma State Cowboys and how Cowboy wrestling is at the top. How Cowboy wrestling, is up there. That we can pat ourselves on the back. We were wrong. They were not, they didn't win the team title, but they did get up there, and we were right. They were going to be up there. And one of the things I look at when we go across this transfer portal draft, so-called draft is what we're going to call it here. You kind of look at it like it is. You see, okay, my 97, let's say my 197 isn't good enough. Okay, for instance, AJ Ferrari just hit. Let me see if I can land AJ Ferrari to hit the draft. I think that in terms of, the wrestling sense, that's just how I feel it is. That's how I feel it has become. I feel it has turned itself into a draft to the point where it's like, okay, it's a draft. It's a draft. You got to take that guy, this guy, And I feel like that's going to be a huge difference, because when you look at that Oklahoma State Cowboy team, look at how many of them came from the transfer portal. So you say David Taylor definitely won the summer draft, getting a lot of those guys. But the difference here is, if David Taylor can keep doing that and now is able to recruit, because let's look at the critiques here. Bo Bassett did not go to Penn State. He's set to wrestle Iowa because he committed Iowa. So now you're looking at, okay, Cael just lost one of the best wrestlers there is to recruit in the country. Now you look at, okay, are you going to start to see Cael not land a lot of those recruits, and some of those recruits that he's supposed to, because what's going on is people don't want to be in Cael country anymore. And I think that is something good to say, because now you have David Taylor that's no longer there. A lot of people used to say, well, oh no, I might be able to roll around with David Taylor if I go to Penn State. Not no more. And you even look at, you don't even have Gilman over there anymore. David Taylor took some pieces with him, and then to have, so many of them go, it just makes you really think, like, hey, what's going on here? And it really makes you think, what's the you know what's the what's the chance here? What's the great cause here? What's the difference here? What's going to make everything or more different? And one of the things we look at is Roman Bravo Young, the most, I thought, technical sound scrambler of college wrestling, not now. He's at Cowboy RTC. So now you say you don't even got a technical guy that can get a good roll around for some of those younger guys. You say, okay, RBY can really show you how to scramble. He's not there anymore. So now you say, okay, you wonder if, Cael Sanderson this year was able to get it done, but he had a lot of guys like Carter and guys that were already there, and some guys that did some really good wrestling for Team Sanderson. Is this the year? And are we going to start to see that Cael Sanderson fall, as you see there's a lot of goers? Yeah, you got Rocco Welch, but listen, at the end of the day, it's all going to be about how this draw is going to get, because, the bracket work of the NCAA wrestling this year was absolutely phenomenal. When you saw some of the stuff like Wyatt Henderson, who would have ever thought? But we did. I did. That was my draft pick. We talked about that 285 weight class, and we were saying that there's a key to victory for Wyatt Henderson, and guess what? It happened. So, if you want to sit there and say, well, maybe sometimes these guys are right, you're right. Sometimes we are right. But when we get to, is this Cael Sanderson going to start to fall? Maybe, because you're looking at these teams and you're saying to yourself, and we're saying to ourselves, what's going to happen here? And that's because you're looking at it one way versus the other way. What's going to happen here? You're right. Yes, they beat their score last year, but now Strachey's gone. So that's it. Got to find somebody else. And, yeah, you got Rocco Walsh, but let's see what goes on here. Let's see what happens. Let's see how it takes itself, because this is going to get interesting. So you're not going to have that same squad when you talk about, okay, well, they had Braden Davis, they had good. Listen, I look at it just barely like this. Not weight by weight were they into the final. So you look at, there was some good behind the, as we call consolation wrestling. There was a lot of good consolation wrestling, as I'll say. That's what I'm going to say for now. There was a lot of good consolation wrestling from Penn State, but you look at, okay, this was a really good Cowboy team. This was, you had a good Nebraska Husker team as well. So you look at, okay, if some of these other schools are providing this, and all those athletes that used to say, I want Penn State, David Taylor's out. So I do think in the next couple of years, you're going to start to see, without those recruits in this class because you could tell there's a lot of those younger Penn State guys, they're not tight like those old guys used to be. Like, you look at some of them, they're not real tight like those other guys used to be. Kel Sanderson used to have some good 125s, 133s, RBY, for instance. Roman Bravo Young, real good 33. He just doesn't have it like that anymore. And I think if that goes across the board, you're going to start to see Penn State is going to fall. And I think when they fall, I don't think it's going to be for just a year. I think this third time, if they fall, I think it's going to be a couple years. They're going to have a drought of no. Now, they may still get a trophy. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think they're going to win the team title. I don't think. I think as you start to see some of these younger guys that aren't as good, because we're already starting to see some of the best 125s and recruits are not going to Penn State. And now that you're seeing this coaching change with coaches all over, like you got Ashnault at Princeton and you've got Taylor head of the Oklahoma State Cowboys. And when you start seeing more of that stuff, you're going to say, okay. And the reason why the recruits weren't lined up before he left, because everybody, well, I don't know if everybody was under the consumption, but I thought, with Coleman Scott going over there, we thought it was going to be heavy favorite Coleman Scott job. David Taylor gets the job. Great, he did, because did a great job at Natty's. You'll never know, but I guess you could say, would Coleman Scott have gotten Wyatt Henderson, Dean Hamady Jr.? Would he have gotten those guys that David Taylor brought in? And when you ask yourself that, you say they're two different guys. When you talk about Olympic level wrestling, you talk about David Taylor was at a nice height of that. He wasn't, I understand he wasn't at the level of, John Smith and some of those greats, but he was at a level where you can kind of say to yourself, it was pretty good. I think it was better than I can say I think it was better if you put Coleman Scott up against David Taylor. I think David Taylor wins every time. And I think that goes to show, like, if you want to line up a resume, I should say resume, look at Coleman Scott. He was in North Carolina. The question you ask yourself is, how many times did North Carolina get a team trophy at Nationals? How many times? Yes, they had a national champ, Austin O'Connor. But ask yourself, how many times did they get a team trophy? How many times? And, when we really base it down, if we say in terms of a team title, because I'm not sure in terms of, second, third, but in terms of team title, no, you haven't. In terms of All-Americans, yeah, you got that. Okay. I give you that. But how many team titles? How many, like, you understand where I'm coming at here. Like, okay. And first off, I think he was gaining a vast majority, I would say. He had Tony Ramos there. You got to give Ramos some credit. Because, Ramos, when he was wrestling in college, Ramos was good. So you say that tailors to something. And I'm not saying Coleman Scott wasn't good. Don't get it twisted. But I'm saying, Tony Ramos can scrap. Tony Ramos knows how to move. You know how it was. So with that being said, of Tony, you say, okay, you had Tony over there. You give up your head coach position to think you're going to line yourself up for Oklahoma State. But look at John Smith, nice head of the program for Oklahoma State University. And you look at that and you say, okay, John Smith was a great coach. He got some team titles. He did very well in his tenure of being a head coach over there. And you say, okay, is Coleman Scott the guy to follow it up? Oh, Coleman Scott's is gonna take over. Coleman Scott's gonna take over the Coleman Scott's gonna take over the program. Coleman Scott's gonna do this. Coleman Scott's gonna do that. Okay, when we talk about Coleman Scott doing this and that, but let's look and think about this. He just wasn't the guy. Okay, I could understand if your resume was long, you had, a couple trophies under there, you had tons of, national champs through your tender, and you look at that and you say, okay, that's not the case. That's not the case right now. And when you look at that being the case and that not being the case, you look at that and you say to yourself, okay, there's a reason they went with David Taylor, and you look at that is successful. He got a team trophy in his first season, that is just very well amazing, for David Taylor. That is really great for David Taylor. And that's something you look at and you say, okay, amazing for David Taylor. When you look at Team David Taylor, you look at something that is very well, a growing section. Now, would Coleman Scott have brought Thomas Gilman? Would Coleman Scott have brought RBY there? Would Coleman Scott have brought all these all-time greats? I don't think Coleman Scott was going to bring that. I think you look at Coleman Scott, you wonder if he was even going to be able to get Ramos to go over there. And that's a good question to ask yourself. Would he have brought Tony Ramos? Would you have got Ramos to be able to leave where he was at? And the question is, the question you say to yourself is, what could you have done? What could it have done? What would the difference have made here? And what's the difference that we could possibly critique here? Is I don't think would Coleman Scott have done the job that David Taylor did? I don't think so. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that would have happened. I don't think that's something that in the future. I don't think at all. I think that when you talk in terms of, that David Taylor Coleman Scott conversation, I can see why they went with Taylor. Taylor brings tenacity that just isn't there. You understand David Taylor in his time was able to, wrestle guys like Jordan Burroughs, wrestle guys like, many guys in his tender underworld wrestling. And you understand he was a 4-time NCAA finalist, and multiple-time champ. And when you look at that and you say that, you understand that it's something where you say, okay, let's talk about Team David Taylor. Let's talk about, he easily 4-time All-American. And when you look at David Taylor, he was a great wrestler and learned a lot in his wrestling time. And you say, okay, was this the difference and the big difference? And was this a difference maker for the Oklahoma State University Cowboys. And yeah, you let that guy take over the program. And if you're John Smith right now, you're saying to yourself, that's the right guy. First season's got a trophy, you know. First season's got a amazing coaching staffs, got guys that just is absolutely up there, you know. And you look, he gets Wyatt Henderson that takes down Gable Steveson, and you look at that and you say to yourself, okay, this guy was right. And they're probably looking, I would be saying to myself, could Coleman Scott have done a job that good? There's no way to know, because there's no way of knowing if whether he would have landed the recruits the way David Taylor did. There's no way of knowing if he would have got, you know, the things he was supposed to get. And you understand that there's no way of knowing which way it was going to go, which way it was or wasn't going to go, because it's just not easy to say that. But what we do know that we can definitively say is that Taylor was the right choice, because now you got another trophy. You know, you look at, okay, the decisions that were made. You know, Taylor won that draft for the summer, as the so-called draft, you know, that transfer portal. So you understand, you know, the greatness that has been brought forth, and you understand the impact it is going to have. I can say this with great ease. David Taylor will be getting a team title in his tenure. At some point, there will be a team title over there. It's only a matter of time, because you look at how well that coaching staff is, and those guys that are doing very well, and the wrestling they do, and just when you looked at the sheer folder, that Oklahoma State Cowboy team, they did a lot of good wrestling. You know, what's going to be exciting to see is Angelo, you know, when we talk about, you know, some of the notable matches out of Oklahoma's year, is that Angelo Ferrari. Is Angelo Ferrari going to be very well the guy? You know, and I talk about Angelo Ferrari because he's all the way over at Iowa, but look, I was right. How did Gabe Arnold look? I'm just saying, like, you know, could Angelo Ferrari have done a better job? Yes, I believe it. You know, I definitely believe it. You know, when you look at that 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 Iowa team, and I say that because when you look at that Iowa team, you know, it is one of those teams where you say, hey, you know, they're great, but I think Angelo should have trusted himself. I think he should have trusted himself, and I say that because I think that it was more or less a really good job by, you know, the Hawkeyes. They had some good wrestling, but when you look at a guy like Gabe Arnold, you know, and we talk about Gabe Arnold, and when we really break down Gabe Arnold, and we look at Gabe and we talk about Gabe, and when you say, okay, we're looking and we're talking about Gabe, and we're looking about that, you say, okay, you know, what, you know, could Angelo had done a better job? I believe so. I can definitively say so. And I say that because when you look at, you know, 184, you just know that it was not a Gabe Arnold. It was not a Gabe Arnold ran weight. And, you know, I think that there's, you know, I see why Angelo ultimately decided not to wanna go. You know, I see why he decided that. But I understand that the reason for Gabe Arnold not wanting to, for Angelo Ferrari not wanting to, not wanting to go through is I see it. You see Carter Starachi runs the weight. Starace runs the weight. So when you see Carter Starace runs the weight, you're looking at it like, do I have a chance of winning the national title? And he says, well, let me not go and do it like this. So I definitely think it's interesting. It's definitely, Gabe Arnold was not an All-American, and I felt like Angelo could definitely have been an All-American. So I definitely think that in terms of like conversation piece, I think Angelo could have done better than Gabe. But when you look at when you look at the sheer fold, and you say that, that's the things I'm talking about, like that some of these teams have some really good like backups that next year when those guys are starters, you're gonna see some of these programs look a little better, and you're gonna see. I think next year is gonna be, I think the team race next year, if this transfer portal or draft, as I so call it, phase out the way it does, I think that you're gonna see. I think you're gonna see if Oklahoma State brings another good team and Nebraska, I think you're going to see a tight team race between Nebraska, Oklahoma State, and with Penn State and some of the places they're filling, if some of those guys that they have there, are guys that are not going to be there, if the guys that replace them do not perform the way those guys did, I don't think they outperform their team score like they did this year from last year. But I definitely think it's going to be an interesting year depending on how some of these squads look. But with that being said, I'm going to draw in near the end. This is this week's episode, transfer portal, Oklahoma State Cowboys, and a little 184, Gabe Arnold, Angelo Ferrari talk. But other than that, that is this week's episode. This is the weigh-in by Benoit Chestnut and normally Sebastian Romero. But as I always say, we'll get back to our regularly scheduled program soon. Weigh in, out.
The weigh-in where stories ignite.